Chapter 17 in our Read Aloud book, Holes. For the next week and a half, the boys continued to dig in and around the area where X-Ray had supposedly found the gold tube. They widened X-Ray's hole, as well as the holes Armpit and Squid had been digging, until the fourth day, when all three holes met and formed one big hole. As the days wore on, the warden became less and less patient. She arrived later in the morning and left earlier in the afternoon. Meanwhile, the boys continued to dig later and later. "This is no bigger than it was when I left you yesterday," she said after arriving late one morning. Well after sunrise. "What have you been doing down there?" "Nothing," said Squid. It was the wrong thing to say. At just that moment, Armpit was returning from a bathroom break. "How nice of you to join us," she said. "And what have you been doing?" "I had to, go." The warden jabbed at Armpit with her pitchfork, knocking him backward into the big hole. The pitchfork left 3 holes in the front of his shirt and 3 tiny spots of blood. "You're giving these boys too much water," the warden told Mr. Penensky. They continued to dig until late afternoon, long after all the other groups had finished for the day. Stanley was down in the big hole, along with the other 6 boys. They had stopped using the wheelbarrows. He dug his shovel into the side of the hole. He scooped up some dirt and was raising it up to the surface when Zigzag's shovel caught him in the side of the head. He collapsed. He wasn't sure if he passed out or not. He looked up to Zigzag's wild head staring down at him. "I ain't digging that dirt up," Zigzag said. "That's your dirt." "Hey, Mom," Magnet called. "Caveman been hurt." Stanley brought his fingers up the side of his neck. He felt his wet blood and a pretty big gash just below his ear. Magnet helped Stanley to his feet, then up and out of the hole. Mr. Sir made a bandage out of a piece of the sack of sunflower seeds and taped it over Stanley's wound. Then he told him to get back to work. It isn't nap time. When Stanley returned to the hole, Zigzag was waiting for him. "That's your dirt," Zigzag said. "You have to dig it up. It's covering up my dirt." Stanley felt a little dizzy. He could see a small pile of dirt. It took him a moment to realize that it was the dirt which had been on his shovel when he was hit. He scooped it up, then Zigzag dug his shovel into the ground underneath where Stanley's dirt had been. Chapter 18. The next morning, Mr. Sir marched the boys to another section of the lake, and each boy dug his own hole, 5 feet deep and 5 feet wide. Stanley was glad to be away from the big hole. At least now he knew just how much he had to dig for the day, and it was a relief not to have other shovels swinging past his face or the warden hanging around. He dug his shovel into the dirt and then slowly dumped it into a pile. He had to make his turn smooth and slow. If he jerked too quickly, he felt a throbbing pain just above his neck where Zigzag's shovel had hit him. That part of his head between his neck and ear was considerably swollen. There were no mirrors in camp, but he imagined he looked like he had a hard-boiled egg sticking out of him. The remainder of his body hardly hurt at all. His muscles had strengthened, and his hands were tough and calloused. He was still the slowest digger, but not at all much slower than Magnet. Less than 30 minutes after Magnet returned to camp, Stanley spat into his hole. After his shower, he put his dirty clothes into his crate and got out of his box of stationery. He stayed in the tent to write the letters so Squid and the other boys wouldn't make fun of him for writing to his mother. "Dear Mom and Dad, camp is hard, but challenging. We've been running obstacle courses and have to swim long distances on the lake. Tomorrow we learn." He stopped writing as Zero walked into the tent, then returned to his letter. He didn't care what Zero thought. Zero was nobody. "To rock climb. I know that sounds scary, but don't worry." Zero was standing beside him now, watching him write. Stanley turned and felt his neck throb. "I don't like it when you read over my shoulder, okay?" Zero said nothing. "I'll be careful it's not all fun and games here, but I think I'm getting a lot out of it. It builds character. The other boys—" "I don't know how," said Zero. "What?" "Can you teach me?" Stanley didn't know what he was talking about. "Teach you what? To rock climb?" Zero stared at him with penetrating eyes. "What?" said Stanley. He was hot, tired, and sore. "I want to learn to read and write," said Zero. Stanley let out a short laugh. He wasn't laughing at Zero. He was just surprised. All this time he had thought Zero was reading over his shoulder. "Sorry," he said. "I don't know how to teach." After digging all day, he didn't have the strength to try to teach Zero to read and write. He needed to save his energy for the people who counted. "You don't have to teach me to write," said Zero. "Just to read. I don't have anybody to write to." "Sorry," Stanley said again. His muscles in his hands weren't the only part of his body that had toughened over the past several weeks. His heart had hardened as well. He finished his letter. He barely had enough moisture in his mouth to seal and stamp the envelope. It seemed that no matter how much water he drank, he was always thirsty. Chapter 19. He was awakened one night by a strange noise. At first he thought it might have been some kind of animal, and it frightened him. But as the sleep cleared from his head, he realized that the noise was coming from the cot next to him. Squid was crying. "You okay?" Stanley whispered. Squid's head jerked around. He sniffled and caught his breath. "Yeah, I'm fine," he whispered and sniffed again. In the morning, Stanley asked Squid if he was feeling better. "What are you, my mother?" asked Squid. Stanley raised and lowered one shoulder. "I got allergies, okay?" said Squid. "Okay," said Stanley. "You opened your mouth again, and I'll break your jaw." Stanley kept his mouth shut most of the time. He didn't talk too much to any of the boys, afraid that he might say the wrong thing. They called him Caveman and all that, but he couldn't forget that they were dangerous too. They were all here for a reason. As Mr. Sir would say, this wasn't a Girl Scout camp. Stanley was thankful that there were no racial problems. X-Ray, Armpit, and Zero were black. He, Squid, and Zigzag were white. Magnet was Hispanic. On the lake, they were all the same reddish-brown color, the color of dirt. He looked up from his hole to see the water truck and its trailing dust cloud. His canteen was still almost a quarter full. He quickly drank it down, then took his place in line, behind Magnet and in front of Zero. The air was thick with heat, dust, and exhaust fumes. Mr. Sir filled the canteens. The truck pulled away. Stanley was back in his hole, shovel in hand, when he heard Magnet call out, "Anybody want some sunflower seeds?" Magnet was standing at ground level, holding a sack of seeds. He popped a handful into his mouth, chewed and swallowed, shells and all. "Over here," called X-Ray. The sack looked to be about half full. Magnet rolled it up to the top, then tossed it to X-Ray. "How do you get them without Mr. Sir seeing you?" asked Armpit. "I can't help it," Magnet said. He held up both hands, wiggling his fingers, and laughed. My fingers are like magnets." The sack went from X-Ray to Armpit to Squid. "It's sure good to eat something that doesn't come from a can," said Armpit. Squid tossed the sack to Zigzag. Stanley knew it would come to him next. He didn't even want it. From the moment Magnet shouted, "Anybody want some sunflower seeds?" he knew there would be trouble. Mr. Sir was sure to come back. And anyway, the salted shells would only make him thirsty. "Coming your way, Caveman," said Zigzag. Airmail and special delivery. It's unclear whether the seeds spilled before they got to Stanley or if he dropped the bag. It seemed to him that Zigzag hadn't rolled up the top before throwing it, and that was the reason he didn't catch it. But it all happened very fast. One moment the sack was flying through the air, and the next thing Stanley knew, the sack was in his hole and the seeds were spilled across the dirt. "Oh, man," said Magnet. "Sorry," Stanley said as he tried to sweep the seeds back into the sack. "I don't want to eat dirt," said X-Ray. Stanley didn't know what to do. "The truck's coming," shouted Zigzag. Stanley looked at the approaching dust cloud, then back at the spilled seeds. He was in the wrong place at the wrong time. What else is new? He dug his shovel into his hole and tried to turn over the dirt and bury the seeds. What he should have done, he realized later, was knock one of the dirt piles back into his hole. But the idea of putting dirt into his hole was unthinkable. "Hello, Mr. Sir," said X-Ray. "Back so soon?" "It seems like you were just here," said Armpit. "Time flies when you're having fun," said Magnet. Stanley continued to turn the dirt over in his hole. "You Girl Scouts having a good time?" asked Mr. Sir. He moved from one hole to another. He kicked a dirt pile by Magnet's hole, and then he moved towards Stanley. Stanley could see 2 seeds at the bottom of his hole as he tried to cover them up. "Well, what do you know, Caveman?" said Mr. Sir, standing over him. "It looks like you found something." Stanley didn't know what to do. "Dig it out," Mr. Sir said. "We'll take it to the warden. Maybe she'll give you the rest of the day off." "It's nothing," Stanley muttered. "Let me be the judge of that, Mr. Sir." Stanley reached down and pulled up the empty burlap sack. He tried to hand it to Mr. Sir, but he wouldn't take it. "So tell me, Caveman," said Mr. Sir, "how did my sack of sunflower seeds get into your hole?" "I stole it from your truck." "You did?" "Yes, Mr. Sir. What happened to all the sunflower seeds? I ate them. By yourself? Yes, Mr. Sir. Hey, caveman, shouted Armpit. How come you didn't share any with us? That's cold, man, said X-Ray. I thought you were our friend, said Magnet. Mr. Sir looked around from one boy to another, then back to Stanley. We'll see what the warden has to say about this. Let's go. Stanley climbed up out of his hole and followed Mr. Sir to the truck. He still held the empty sack. It felt good to sit inside the truck and out of the direct rays of the sun. Stanley was surprised he could feel good about anything at that moment. But he did. It felt good to sit down on a comfortable seat for a change. And as the truck bounced along the dirt, he was able to appreciate the air blowing through the open window on his hot and sweaty face. Chapter 20. I'll stop there for today, and then tomorrow we'll go back to poetry, and the following day we'll do more holes from our reading from our book about holes.